yesterday was Mitterrand's funeral. And about the only thing left of chapter one was the uh, it talked about it just so happened that John F. Kennedy and Bobby Kennedy during 1960 in April came through Richmond, Indiana, and had a campaign stop there. And it says that was 3 months before Dan left for Brazil, which was his first posting, working for the CIA under the USAID Office of Public Safety. And so he was there in charge of security when the Kennedy entourage came through. They just kind of threw that in for context. But it also talked about Frank Sinatra decided out of the middle of nowhere, and we already know about Frank Sinatra's connections to the mafia in Cuba and the CIA. We've covered that in other stories. So Frank Sinatra, out of the goodness of his heart, contacts the Chamber of Commerce office to get in touch with the Mitterrand family to host a benefit in the local area in a civics hall that sat 4,200 people. And of course, he donated all of the proceeds to the family's educational fund for the children. So you have the Secretary of State, you have the Eisenhower's son in law, and now you have Frank Sinatra all showing up for the benefit of the Mitterrand family. And that pretty much, I'm just going to close it out with saying that in Washington, the director of the Catholic Conference held a press conference to demand an international investigation of charges that U.S. officials in the Agency for International Aid, which was the precursor to USAID, were instructing police in Brazil and Uruguay, two stations that Mitterrand had been at, in the techniques of torture. And he mentioned Dan by name. The local newspaper that had been filled with Dan Mitterrand stories basically decided not to print that story. So it talks about Frank Sinatra arriving there. Jerry Lewis was with them, and they talk a little bit about the event. Moving on to chapter 2, it talks about Dan Mitterrand's departure from Indiana as part of a team that Dwight Eisenhower was fielding against the nation's newest and most potential villain. And of course, we know that 1960 was the ending of the Eisenhower presidency, and at the end of the year would elect Kennedy as president. So lots of hype going on in the Eisenhower administration about the Soviet Union. And in 1959, of course, Castro had staged the revolution with the aid of the CIA over Batista. In fact, at the height of the 1960 presidential campaign, the one sure fact most American voters knew about Latin America was the distance of Cuba from the Florida coastline. It made headlines every day as being 90 miles off the coast of the United States and an imminent threat. Even though by that time, Castro had not even contacted the Soviet Union. And Castro commented in the demonization of him winning the revolution and rejecting the CIA's dangled incentives for him to collaborate with the United States and allow all of the former United States companies to resume their operations there, to include the CIA and the mafia. Castro commented, quote, You Americans keep saying that Cuba is 90 miles from the US. I say the US is 90 miles from Cuba, and for us, that is worse, unquote. And he was absolutely right. Castro was barely having routed the dictator Batista when conservatives in the US government launched a propaganda campaign against him. In April 1959, Vice President Richard Nixon met with Castro in Washington and afterwards wrote a confidential memorandum to the CIA, the State Department, and the White House, stating flatly that Castro was either a communist dupe or a disciple and should be treated accordingly. So that began the campaign against Castro. And supposedly, if you read the literature of that meeting, Castro made it perfectly clear to Nixon that he wasn't going to be a CIA stooge, and that pissed them off. At the FBI, J. Edgar Hoover told Nixon that he agreed with his assessment of Castro. 11 months later, President Eisenhower ordered the CIA to secretly begin to prepare an invasion of Cuba that would dispose of Castro as well. The Democrat presidential campaign of 1960 reflected the confusion in the electorate's mind over Castro's revolution. John F. Kennedy began the year by referring to Castro as a young rebel in the tradition of Simon Bolivar. That was before the U.S. investors, who controlled 40% of Cuba's sugar, expressed outrage over Castro's reforms. And among those was none other than William Pauly. When Castro took the larger sugarcane fields, including the ones owned by his own family, he offered a payment of a 20-year bond yielding 4.5% annual interest. He proposed to pay for the land at the value that the U.S. owners had placed on it when paying their Cuban taxes. And that, everyone, is a reoccurring theme. That happened in Nicaragua, Guatemala, Chile. Every one of the quote-unquote communist was giving the fair market value deemed by the U.S. owners of property in those countries to get the U.S. owners out of the countries. So that doesn't sound very communistic to me, because a communist would just take the property and say, screw you. The companies involved, the author was not, to the companies involved, that was not a fair offer. It was only fair when they were paying taxes. It wasn't fair when they were going to be paid that value in order to make them leave the country. Which brings us, of course, to today. How does that work with these Chinese companies that have bought the farmland in America? That's going to be a very interesting tell, in my opinion, to see exactly how they are treated, given the fact that we know how the US treated all of the people in all of these other countries when they were kicked out of these countries. They just went back in and overthrew the government. Washington also began an economic war immediately, cutting off sugar purchases from Cuba. As mistrust of Castro spread, Senator Kennedy, now the Democrat nominee, changed his tactics. He suggested the Eisenhower administration should have avoided Castro's revolution altogether and worked with Batista. Between the time Kennedy was elected and his swearing in as president, Eisenhower broke diplomatic relations with Cuba. As a result, the new president entered office with a bipartisan foreign policy. Both the Democrats and the Republicans had united in their resolve to get Castro out of office. And of course, we know on January 17th, 3 days before Kennedy took office, Eisenhower assassinated Patrice Lumumba in the Congo. So it does seem like they were setting the stage to sabotage the JFK administration. So before the end of the decade, Dan Mederone, along with hundreds of other public safety advisors, had been sent into combat against the quote unquote communists in Brazil and elsewhere throughout Latin America. And keep in mind, we have read State Department declassified cables that indicate the CIA agents on the ground in these countries were cabling back to the CIA that they weren't, in fact, communist. There was no communist affiliation at all. Yet, every CIA intelligence estimate ignored the agents on the ground and perpetuated the fact that they're all communist. Yet the battle that they entered, unlike Vietnam, was not a shooting war. US policymakers saw communism on the continent as a hidden enemy that would subvert a society from within, so they prepared secret counterattacks. In Vietnam, the Green Beret often defined war as months of boredom illustrated by moments of terror. That characterization was truer still of the hidden war in which Mederone had volunteered. Even when the shooting in Brazil began, Mederone's routine remained comparatively the same. It was filled with inspection tours and conversations among police stations, requisitions for weapons and supplies, making speeches, and taking care of paperwork. Police advisors like Mederone were the foot soldiers in Latin America. The CIA officials were the officer corps. The ambassadors and ranking military attaches and the CIA station chiefs were the upper echelons of each U.S. embassy. They were the field commanders. Unlike Mederone, he was not given his unit to command until he arrived in Uruguay. The CIA officials and the ambassadors overshadowed and basically ignored the troops on the ground. Had Mederone chosen to stay in Indiana, he would be years away from his retirement. And it was basically decided that, as we discussed yesterday, he took the job because of the money. His service in Brazil and Uruguay happened to coincide with critical periods in both countries. In other words, he's one of the people that showed up every time there was going to be a coup. Mederone deserves no more than a footnote in the history chapters. Then in death, Mederone became a symbol. Internationally, he was treated as the embodiment of the US policy in Latin America. As a result, to understand the significance of his life, the message behind his killing requires turning away from his everyday routine and looking deeper into the overall involvement. It was not considered unusual behavior for a Midwesterner at the threshold of 40 who had never traveled abroad, quit his job, created his belongings, and uprooted his wife and children to set off to live in a new continent. Richmond speculated on his abrupt departure. 4 years after he became chief of police, some said that it was just because he ran out of challenges. He had asked the city for a pay raise. They had turned him down. That's the reason why some people speculated it was because of money. Contacts that he had made during his term at the FBI school informed him that there was a foreign aid program the State Department had began to recruit advisors to train police forces overseas. Dan secretly submitted his application. So again, this FBI training school served as a scouting program for them to contact people to work in USAID CIA-controlled programs. The head of the program was a guy by the name of Byron Engel. And before we go any further, I do want to go back and talk about one thing. You remember yesterday when we were talking about the Indiana University School of Police Administration? Actually, it was a department within a school, and the department was set up in 1948, which is really interesting because, of course, 1948 was the very time that we are creating the CIA and setting up Operation Gladio in Europe and around the world. It did eventually become a school, but not officially until 1972. It was called in 1972, it was called the Public and Environmental Affairs Program. That was the name of the new school that was set up. It was comprised of police administration, criminal justice, and public safety. It was named after a guy called Paul O'Neill, who just so happens to have served as a director on RAND's board, and RAND is another CIA front. He also did a couple of years as the U.S. Treasurer. He also spent time as Alcoa, which is an aluminum company, president. And the guy that basically ran the program at Indiana University was a guy by the name of Robert Borkenstein. And you'll never guess what two things he's most notorious for. He created the breath analyzer for DUIs. He also created the polygraph. He was the chair of the department. He was the chair of the department from 1936 until 1976. And they trained all Indiana State Police. And when you research them, you also find out that Indiana University had a joint program with none other than Michigan State University, which ran the Phoenix program. So I just wanted to let you know I went back and found that. That is absolutely crazy. So, moving on. Let's see. So, Byron Engel, when he was selected to head this program, he had been serving as the former personnel director of the police department in Kansas City. And Kansas City comes up not real often, but often enough for me to know that Kansas City, Missouri was a hotbed of feeders of their police department into very nefarious things. And it was basically ran as kind of a Democrat stronghold to place people in some nefarious places. Engel purposely set all of the federal salaries in the Office of Public Safety high enough above any police chiefs in order to be able to recruit them away from those jobs. He primarily focused his recruitment on Mississippi and Indiana because they had the lowest pay scale for police chiefs. Weirdly enough, Indiana is the home of the Ku Klux Klan, and Mississippi wasn't very far behind. By enlisting Engel, Dan Mederone received more money. When they contacted him, the offer was too good to walk away from. So in May of 1960, a month after John F. Kennedy came campaigning through Richmond, the International Cooperation Administration interviewed Dan in Washington and basically offered him a job. In Richmond, Dan went in to speak with the mayor about a leave of absence. They decided that he couldn't have a leave of absence based on Indiana law, and that if he came back after the leave of absence, he'd have to go back to being a patrolman. So basically, he resigned. Standard training at the time called for 5 weeks in Washington, D.C., and a 3 months study of the Portuguese language through an immersion program in Brazil before Dan would begin his duties. Dan, along with most other U.S. public safety advisors, would come to depend heavily on the use of interpreters. Dan Mideron said, "I want to talk to you about moving to South America," when he brought it up with his family during a discussion that he was taking his family on this new job. So Hank and the children landed in Brazil in September of 1960. During that time, there was a lot going on in Brazil. The character that the author assesses of Brazil is that it was a very laid back, non-violent country. Their war of independence from Portugal was fought without a single dead body. They didn't literally fight because it just was not within the Brazilian population, who valued peace and discussion, to take up arms against each other. They also, on their own accord, had ended slavery with no bloodshed. Now, they still treated the indigenous Indians in Brazil like second-class citizens, but they had officially gotten rid of slavery. The people at the State Department talked about Latin America by describing it as a dirty place. There was a popular conception that it was a very unhealthy place to live, that it had battled tuberculosis, yellow fever, and it just did not have, in the State Department, didn't have a good reputation. Even after all of that, Latin America remained, according to the State Department, intellectually contaminating. Reporters at the New York Times described it as a notorious graveyard. At Harvard University, the dean of the faculty was understood to have been referring to Latin America when he remarked, "Second-rate subjects attract second-rate minds." 6 months after Dan Mideron arrived in Brazil, the dean of Harvard, McGeorge Bundy, who we first came across a long time ago in Operation Gladio, but we highlighted the entire Bundy family as a skull and bones family. He was hired by John F. Kennedy as his foreign policy advisor. Also, another Harvard professor, Henry Kissinger, confessed later in his career that his interest in world politics stopped at Latin America. He didn't even view it as worth his time. And then the author goes back and talks about, as late as 1899, a publication called Literary Digest reported a strong sentiment in the United States for annexing Cuba. And campaigning in 1920, Franklin Roosevelt told crowds that as Assistant Secretary of Navy, he had helped to run a couple of the continent's smaller republics. Quote, "The facts are that I wrote Haiti's constitution myself, and if I do say so, I did a pretty good constitution." Lanier Winslow, once the first Secretary of the United States Embassy in Mexico City, told friends that Mexico had the makings of a great country. Quote, "If you could dip it in the sea for half an hour and all of the Mexicans drowned." Unquote. So you had to get rid of all the Mexicans in order for Mexico to be worth their while. This is literally the people in the State Department making these statements. Latin America bore this neglect and contempt with anger, resentment, especially in Brazil. And then it talks about a whole bunch of cartoons that they used to publish, mocking the Americans because the Americans looked down on them. One of their famous authors in Brazil expanded his attack on America, saying the enemy was an American democracy preoccupied with its own materialism. Untempered by other values, such democracy extinguished respect for any superiority that cannot be turned into self-interest. He also said that Latin America was being seduced by the greatness and strength of the US, voluntarily making its society in a northern mold, which is literally what they were doing. By the early 1960s, the US was more convinced than ever that they had vital knowledge that they needed to inject into Latin America. And of course, that was all because they had found oil and gold and all kinds of natural resources down there that the oligarchs wanted. In Washington, Byron Engel had been charged with putting together a task force that could train police in Asia, Africa, and Latin America. He had been chosen because of his experience in training Japanese police in the immediate aftermath of World War II. And again, for anyone new, MacArthur was basically running Japan. And they created a national police force using the same fascist in Japan that had imprisoned the US military during World War II. They had a show trial in Japan, much like the show trial called Nuremberg, that held none of the key fascists responsible for anything that they had done. And you have the exact same thing happening in country after country after country after World War II. There was no accountability. So here's Engel in Japan training fascists how to be national police. He also did a tour in Turkey. And what was going on in the aftermath of World War II? They were setting up the Grey Wolves. And the national police were involved in training the Operation Gladio program called the Grey Wolves. So Engel is just going country after country, setting up Gladio operators under the guise of national police. Okay. It was President Eisenhower who first proposed adapting the training of German and Japanese police to meet the needs of the Cold War. Again, they're using them as proxies to oversee Operation Gladio. Now, Eisenhower told a meeting of National Security Council, quote, "We're building up military forces that we all know wouldn't last a week or 10 days in a hot war. What we are doing about what are we doing about the constabulary forces? In other words, the police, like the, what are they called? The Carabinieri in Italy, who, by the way, was also used as a liaison with their Gladio units in Italy. What the council members asked each other was, what does he mean? Was he literally talking about a rural force? The president had just returned from the Philippines, where policemen were called constabularies. Ike meant police. And the fact that he said that after he had just returned to the Philippines is huge, because who was in the Philippines training up their police force was the CIA. And we saw lots of the Filipino national police deployed to other Asian countries in the form of assassins and terrorists throughout Southeast Asia. Eisenhower wanted that all over the world. And he was going to set up an apparatus to make that happen. With his decision, the project had to be brought under an advisory agency. Police advisors in Okinawa and Japan were under Army control, along with those in Korea and the Philippines. So Eisenhower had set up the same type of capability in Korea, the Philippines, Okinawa, and Japan. Berlin's police advisors reported to the State Department. And the four-man group in Iran came under the Foreign Operations Administration. So they have the same, and that's the Savak, by the way. And we know that Norman Schwarzkopf Sr. set up the Savak National Police Training and basically turned them into terrorists. So the fact that it's being administered in different locations out of different offices in the federal government, Eisenhower wanted a consolidated point for the administration. Officially, the new advisory unit was given to the State Department to be administered as part of foreign aid program, but Engel had other allegiances. He had been recruited by the CIA after it was established in 1947. Engel satisfied the naysayers that his affiliation with the CIA wasn't a problem. In 1955, he was given a title and a secretary and launched what was come to be nicknamed the Free World's Police Force. From the start, some officials within the foreign aid program did not like Engel's operations. Economists happened to be the most outspoken about it. They all said that he was basically doing CIA work under another banner. Engel believed that the executive arm of the government, its police and military, were the last to change. But change itself, at least orderly change, depended on the stability, and Washington was not prepared to underwrite what he had in mind. If Engel was not finding much support at the State Department, he didn't find it at the FBI either. Hoover was on record as saying these new police programs were simply a cover for the CIA to conduct operations in these countries. And he believed Engel's appointment proved his point. At the CIA, the advantages of putting U.S. operatives in close contact with local police was obvious. But as late as the 1960s, with the CIA immersed in training men for Guatemala for an invasion of Cuba, Engel's operation was allowed to operate outside of what was official CIA, but to be used by them for their operations. When Dan Muterone applied to the program in the spring of that year, he was put through a rigorous security check. Since Engel was only fielding 80 advisors at the time, it was easier to screen the people. Until 1959, Engel's outline had called for combating communism and subversion. But then the king of Iran was assassinated by an armored unit said to owe its fidelity to Nasser of Egypt, and more alarming was 200 men sent by Fidel Castro to Panama. When the Kennedy-Johnson team moved into the White House, Engel's program, rather than being dismantled by liberals taking over Washington, acquired a premier patron. Investigating his duties at the Justice Department, Robert Kennedy was impressed by the way the FBI trained policemen around the country and thought the time was right to expand it. To seek solutions to unrest in Latin America, he convened a number of high-ranking officials and called them the Counterintelligence Group, the CIG. The members arrived but were not too enthusiastic about being there. Given the time, they would have worked on what they titled nation building as part of their counterintelligence group. The first chairman of this group was none other than Maxwell Taylor, an Army general who had dropped from favor during the Eisenhower administration for warning the country against the Pentagon's reliance on nuclear weapons. He wrote in his views on a new frontier that he regarded would be a hybrid of different measures in order to fulfill the mission of the United States. He was an intellectual general and served as a counterweight to Curtis LeMay, who basically just wanted to bomb everything. Later, Taylor would be named ambassador to South Vietnam, which is critical because he would be overseeing the drug trade from his perch in South Vietnam. Robert Kennedy actively prodded the counterintelligence group. Its key mission was to develop methods for promoting internal order around the globe. Cabinet departments were represented, and a delegate from the CIA also sat in on the meetings. Out of the counterintelligence group deliberations came John F. Kennedy's Special Forces, a new training in quote unquote counterinsurgency at military schools to include National War College on down. New courses were set up at the Foreign Service Institute to incorporate State Department into these operations. There were training programs set up in the CIA and throughout the military in order to focus on this. Furthermore, the counterintelligence group saw early on how important police would be in a country's battle against anybody rebelling against what they intended to do. So it set up a committee on police and police training, and as chairman, appointed a career diplomat by the name of that stands for Ural, Ural, the mountains in Russia, Alexis Johnson. Johnson resembled the British politician Edward Heath, having one of those long faces. When Lyndon Johnson became president, he sent Ambassador Johnson to South Vietnam as deputy ambassador to Taylor. Alexis Johnson's committee recognized immediately that there was a new central and more powerful police office, and that decision led to the committee's discussions. The Pentagon argued that any expanded police effort should be done under their purview. A State Department veteran, future Ambassador Johnson, found it easy to insist that training of police was a civil function and couldn't be done in the Department of Defense. Having won the battle, Johnson was concerned that the officials of the police program had been turning to the CIA for help that they couldn't get from anywhere else. So, Ingalls' credentials seemed superior to any of his rivals since he had already been responsible for training over 100,000 Japanese police in just under 2 months. Johnson talked with the CIA director and got permission for Ingalls to go into the job. Next came the setting of standards for recruits to this newly prestigious program. Ingalls had been sitting in on Johnson's committee meetings, and he had the answer. That was Ingalls' cue to produce a tablet that he gave around the table to the people to say, what kind of qualities do you want? And after everybody wrote down what they wanted, he gathered up all the papers and he said, one of you wants them to be young, athletically built, dynamic people, but at the same time, all of the rest of you wrote down criteria that would take an average person 90 years to gain the experience. So something has to give. So he basically ignored what everybody said in the meeting by doing this exercise and decided that he himself was going to have sole authority over all hiring. After all, he had done that in Kansas City. It was not a problem for him. The police academy was another of Ingalls' deferred ideas whose time had come. Until then, the State Department had been importing promising young officers into the U.S. and training them in none other than local police departments, basically riding along with other cops. He didn't want that to continue. So the first alternative was to set up the program immediately. They were going to use a thing called the Inter-American Police Academy. Theodore Brown, a former police chief in Eugene, Oregon, had set that up, and he was the director of the public safety program in Guam. It was ran in Panama Canal Zone, right alongside where the School of Americas would be set up. Captains and majors from around the continent had participated in an 8 to 12-week class, depending on what rank they were. They were then sent to another local Army installation for 2 additional weeks to learn counterinsurgency, and that is where they were basically taught how to torture people. There was a lot of resentment because they basically taught the street police the same way that they were going to teach the lieutenants and captains, and they were treating them all the same. So there was a lot of people that were upset about the way the training was being conducted. There was another issue of the pronounced CIA role in past police training already being conducted within the counterintelligence group. It was now agreed that school would be moved into the United States. There were reports filtering up already of the horrible things that were being taught in Panama. The CIA formulated an answer to the accusations that it later employed with modification when the stories began to appear in print. From 1955 until today, Byron Ingalls, they ran Byron Ingalls' denial and said that they were teaching non-lethal riot control in Panama. Before that, Latin American police were equipped with submachine guns, and they were just teaching them to use tear gas. So that was kind of the counter argument, and there was no mention of the fact that they were teaching waterboarding and all kinds of other torture techniques at the school. So basically, just throw out the counter argument and move on. In August of 1962, John F. Kennedy approved the counterintelligence group's report. However, a year later, the police academy was still functioning in Panama while it was supposed to be moving to the United States, turning out 700 graduates, and pressure was building to move the school to the U.S. Ingalls tried to explain that he was having difficulty finding a place. Then he discovered a thing called the car barn. The barn, more than 200 years old, had been a tobacco warehouse and had been turned into a manufacturing of streetcars for the District of Columbia. O. Roy Chalk, the owner of the transit system, had planned to use it as an office for his law offices. But they determined that the cellar would be the perfect place to have a firing range, and the other 3 floors would be used to train police. What Ingalls didn't know at the time is it was next door to Michael Forrestal, who had worked in McGeorge Bundy's office. Forrestal had served on Johnson's committee, the one that created the whole program. And Forrestal's home estate was next door to this place. I'm sure that's a coincidence. So, only then did Ingle realize that the site he had chosen was next to Forrestal's estate, when Harry Truman's defense secretary had once lived. Drawing on the Inter-American Police Academy, Ingle imported the 20 instructors as the nucleus for his new school. They all spoke Spanish, and since Washington's chief concern remained Latin America, even the FBI donated people to the staff. Although the move out of the Canal Zone had been set for nearly a year, when it finally took place, it just so happened to coincide with a Panama riot of 1964. Again, I'm sure that's just a coincidence. About the time Dan Mederone went to Washington for his cursory training, a younger man also headed to Latin America. He was completing a far more rigorous regimen. The disparity in their preparation reflected the difference in value that Washington placed on the police from Middle America and the people that they were going to use to be in charge of these programs. The recruit in this instance had been 4 years in arriving at the agency in the spring of 1956. The CIA official first went to South Bend, Indiana, through the Notre Dame ROTC program. His name was Philip Burnett Philip Agee. Now, you guys know Philip Agee. Philip Agee turns into a whistleblower later on of the CIA. But now he's part of the USAID, Office of Public Safety, people that are also, in some cases, like Agee, dual-hatted with the CIA because he was recruited by the CIA. It shows you the inner workings of this program basically being a front for the CIA. Agee had come from a middle-class Catholic family in Tampa, Florida, and had already been hired by the CIA. Agee's intellectual approach to Catholicism presented more challenges to him than religion did to a man like Mederone, who had taken his faith as an inheritance. Phil Agee, for example, was tormented by the prospect of an eternal hell. He did, however, find comfort in lessons mastered at Notre Dame, and he agreed with his professors that the prime virtue of any decent citizen was his respect for authority. And that is something that has come up often between the use of the Catholic Church throughout Operation Gladio, is that it cultivates this hierarchy and this discipline where you never question the leaders. So that's very interesting. The CIA recruiter offered Agee a means of escape from going into the Air Force, and he basically was to become an officer, but he became an Air Force officer, but he was going to be assigned into a military unit that was basically a CIA front. So this is one of those examples that we have found numerous times over this study where people in uniform are actually working for the CIA. So Agee said one of the first lessons he learned was that you never referred to the CIA as the agency. It was always referred to as the company, which goes to the whole point that I've made repeatedly, that the international syndicate actually manages the CIA. It is a company working for oligarchs. When his years in the Air Force ended, Agee was transferred to Washington in studies of Spanish, Soviet foreign policy, and communism. The CIA's Office of Training did not waste time on political theory. Instead, the students learned about the expansionist aims of the Soviet Union and ways to foil them. In other words, it was basically a brainwashing course. Almost all of Agui's young colleagues wanted to go into the secret operations field. Agui was called on to master the scores of sub agencies that were embedded in the CIA, to include branches like psychological operations and paramilitary. On graduation, almost everyone had chosen to work in that field. For more instruction, they drove out to a mysterious training ground called the Farm that happened to be Camp Perry, 15 miles outside of Williamsburg, Virginia. The briefing officers informed them that the trainees included foreigners who didn't even know they were in the United States. They were referred to as black trainees, not that they were black, just black covert operations. They were all kept away from people like Agui. The training was physical, in self-defense, lessons in maiming and killing with your bare hands, but mainly the recruits learned to gather information using foreign agents. In 1960, July, Agui's course at Camp Perry had been broadened to include technical operations like telephone tapping, safe cracking, and lock picking. He was introduced into bugging devices that used infrared beams that could be transmitted to basically use the vibrations on windows when people were talking on the inside to overhear what they were saying on the outside. The International Cooperation Administration was sending public safety missions to work in local police departments. That program provided cover for CIA officers. The other police advisors, the one without company ties, were to be kept ignorant of those with the company ties. After Agui had completed his stint at the Farm, his chief CIA contacted suggested strongly that he volunteer for duty in Latin America. Agui wanted to go to Southeast Asia. Among the various CIA divisions, the Western Hemisphere enjoyed the lowest prestige, because they thought the least of those people. A number of former FBI men, veterans, from Argentina and Brazil had moved over to the CIA upon its creation in 1945. Agui was embarrassed to find himself allied with them because he referred to them as gumshoe detectives. So Agui was suspicious for the way that he dug into his new assignment, reading everything about Latin America. His older co-workers assured him that to operate, you didn't need to know anything about it. You just needed a few well-placed contacts. By August 1960, Agui heard exciting news. The branch chief of his division had approved him for an assignment in Ecuador. The CIA was arranging a full-time tutor in Spanish and wanted to get Agui there as soon as possible. His cover was going to be an assistant attaché in the U.S. Embassy. The job was a tribute to Agui's potential. Only one other member of his training class had been assigned earlier to the field, and that man was going no further than New York City. Under State Department cover, Christopher Thorin was appointed to the U.S. mission at the UN. Again, he's a CIA agent. They're literally everywhere. At last, in December 1960, Phil Agui and his wife were flown first class into Ecuador just in time for their Independence Day festivities. Agui's first working day was very exciting. In the evening, him and his wife joined Jim Nolan, the CIA station chief, and went to a party at the home of an Ecuadorian family that controlled all of the country's movie theaters. Every guest that night seemed to be rich and somehow related, either by blood or marriage. Agee had the chance to meet an important contact, a nephew of the country's president, and also dual hatted as a CIA agent. That man, Jorge Acosta Velasco, had lately proved his worth by passing along information to the CIA station to a man called Robert Weatherwax, who had been operating there undercover as none other than a public safety advisor. Weatherwax had recruited the chief of the Ecuadorian intelligence department, who was later exposed as the leader of an illegal secret society of young police officers. Weatherwax dropped from sight after a while because of that. Now, Acosta was advising the CIA that Weathermax could return safely because everything had been taken care of. Phil Agee said that he had a drawer full of money to bribe and pay off anyone so that there would be no trouble. During the time that Dan Miron was making a mild political gesture at permitting Hank to participate in the JFK Richmond dinner, he thought that that was going to help him long term. Since 1955, Lincoln Gordon had been serving as a professor of international economics at Harvard's Graduate School for Business Administration. He particularly prided himself on remaining untainted by the goings on within Harvard. The most significant fact in Gordon's life may have been that he was a boy genius. He basically graduated from Harvard at the age of 19 and went off to be none other than a Rhodes Scholar. So we know where his loyalties lie. After Oxford, he taught at Harvard and served in the government. He was always on important missions, but seldomly the top man. He kind of was one of those Praetorian Guard that Warhamster talks about all the time, stayed behind the scenes. He assisted Paul Hoffman in the agency that administered the Marshall Plan. And we know the Marshall Plan was used to fund Operation Gladio. He was a part of a delegation to the UN Atomic Energy Commission, and during the Eisenhower administration, he also served as a consultant to NATO. Huh, that's really weird. You know, like where they run Operation Gladio. Then, during John F. Kennedy's administration, the academic ranks of Cambridge began to thin. Everybody had been given a job. Paul Henry Nitz had been appointed Assistant Secretary of Defense for International Security. And this guy had said to all of his friends, there were 3 jobs he wanted. And I'm going to name the 3 jobs and who actually got them. He also wanted the job of Secretary of State for Economic Affairs, which George Ball got. And the only one left that he wanted was the National Security Advisor, which McGeorge Bundy got. Bundy was not only 6 years younger than Gordon, he was actually one of Gordon's proteges. So he was a little miffed. Gordon had hired Bundy to work with him on the Marshall Plan. So they were both connected to the funding of Operation Gladio. For a while, it looked like Gordon was just going to be left at Cambridge. He was in the middle of writing a 2-volume study on the Brazilian investment for American oligarchs. But salvation appeared in the autocratic person of Adolf Berle, B-E-R-L-E. Before his inauguration, Kennedy had set up a Latin American task force to establish broad lines of policy, and he named Berle as its chief. When Berle called, he basically offered him a job. Burrell invited Gordon to join his committee as an economist. Gordon didn't really want to do it, but he was enticed to do it because of the Brazil project that he had been working on. Burrell convinced him that the committee would not take too much time, and Lincoln Gordon at last was abroad on other business. During the campaign, John F. Kennedy aides had suggested that he take an initiative in Latin America that was similar to FDR's. And what does that mean? Well, FDR is the one that hired Nelson Rockefeller to go down and basically exploit all of Latin America and determine where all the resources were for the oligarchs so that they could draft up a plan on where to go and overthrow governments. So he wanted help. They were looking for a name. They ended up calling it, let's see, where is that? Alliance, basically the Progress Alliance para el Progreso was the name that they settled on. Gordon was asked to look over the speech that Kennedy was going to give announcing this big program and the money, and basically said, one of the former people that had prepared the speech before Gordon was asked to look at it had said their goal was to, within 10 years, close the economic gap between the U.S. and the Latin American nations. Well, Gordon, having looked in Brazil's economy, said there's no way you can do that. And to say that is disingenuous. The counter to that was, we're not going to be in 10 years. Nobody gives a shit. It's just propaganda. But during the meeting with John F. Kennedy, Gordon was able to raise his objections to even saying it, because while the Kennedy administration may not be there in 10 years, the people on the ground would be there in 10 years. And JFK elected to leave that out of the speech that he gave about it. So, that is probably enough at that point, because we kind of get into the nuts and bolts of Brazil in the next segment of this chapter. And it's probably better. This chapter is a very long chapter. All of these chapters are long. It's probably better that we do all of the Brazil part together, because it kind of sets the stage for what Mitterrand is going to be doing in Brazil. And you'll see how screwed up it is. But we'll do that on our next show. Bridget, go ahead.
Oh my God. This Byron Engel? Oh
yeah.
My God.
Yeah, I have a whole thing on him. Go ahead and talk about him.
Okay, well, I'm trying not to jump too far ahead, but that's part of my nature. Did you know he was the head of the NRA?
Yeah.
Oh my God, right? And did you go into his wife?
I did not.
Oh, can I give you a little?
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay. I'm just going to give you a brief graphic kind of thing. Because, as it turns out, she was... It started with a quote, and I'll read you the quote, then I'll tell you what. Engel's wife, who worked for the American Red Cross, okay, that's a big red flag, in Japan, Saipan, and Tinian, was recruited by the CIA to act as a liaison between the CIA and her husband's International Cooperation Agency / Public Safety Operations at the State Department. So I asked Brock to detail about that. He goes on to say, let's see blah, blah, blah. Her recruitment by the CIA to act as a liaison blurred the lines between civil aid programs and intelligence activities during the Cold War. This role likely facilitated communications and coordination between the CIA and the OPS, which was housed within the CIA and later moved to the USAID. Under Ingalls' leadership was deeply intertwined. Let's see, she leveraged her Red Cross network to use it for intelligence gathering and operational planning.
That's what we've been saying all along. The Red Cross is just another organization that the CIA has exploited for intelligence.
That was her whole role as being at the CIA.
And that is what you just described also is true of Obama's mother.
Right. Well, and that was her experience in Japan and the Pacific Islands.
Yep.
Japan could have been valuable contacts or insights to the local dynamics, which the CIA exploited for intelligence gathering and blah, blah, blah. It said the personal-professional overlap in Ingalls' life, where the family members were drawn into the orbit, which when he says, it says family members, means it wasn't just limited to his wife.
Correct.
But anyway, so, and it goes on to his advisory role in Laos and Cambodia.
So drugs.
Right.
Yeah, Ingle oversaw 52 countries' Office of Public Safety. They were active in over 52 countries. And his initial budget was $200 million through USAID and CIA funds for weaponry, communications, and tactical equipment, which sounds exactly like Operation Gladio. Just saying.
That was the specific OPS initiatives under Ingle included Bolivia, 1956, $1.75 million program.
Yep.
In 56, that's a ton of money to, quote, train their police.
And
in Ghana.
And oh, by the way, don't forget what we learned a long time ago. The Office of Public Safety also used the Los Fresnos, Texas World War II abandoned base to train people on how to use explosives.
Right. And that was, well, in one of the articles that I posted, that was his specialty. And I actually found the CIA declassified documents talking about him setting them up with explosives, on how to create explosives from simple materials. But anyway, it ended up going on about the Congo during Lumumba.
Yeah.
They spent $5 million, Venezuela, Vietnam, Thailand. But one of the other big telling things was one of the books that was written about his blurring the lines in these fields called him a vehement anti-communist. Or does that sound familiar?
Yes.
Just saying.
Yes. Absolutely. So, also, one other thing. When Ingalls eventually leaves the Office of Public Safety because it's dismantled, but it wasn't actually dismantled, by the way. They folded it into, and you're never going to guess. I'm going to give you and SR-71 the opportunity to guess what government agency was created within 12 months of the Office of Public Safety being dismantled. SR-71? Any guesses?
Thank you, Colonel. I don't know if I've got the correct answer to that, but I can tell you what I know today is that we're talking about the Western Hemisphere Institute of Security Cooperation.
Okay, that's the School of Americas.
Yes.
All right, but that's not it. There is a government agency that is functioning today that was created within 12 months of the congressional hearings of the torture and all of the shit in the Office of Public Safety and the money that was being used, the $35 million the CIA gave to the Thailand police to basically leave their borders open, both port and air, for the drug trafficking. So
I got it. I think
who?
The International Criminal Investigative Training Assistance Program.
No, it was the DEA.
Really?
The DEA.
ICITAP absorbed the OPS employees.
And the DEA.
Oh.
Yeah. That's crazy. A lot of the Office of Public Safety also went to work at the DEA. And
that actually makes total sense.
Sure it does, because
with like the Waco incident and things like
that. Yes. The DEA was the alcohol, tobacco, whatever the name of the one was before that. The DEA, if you remember the story of back when we were doing Whitney Webb's book, we talked about calling a phone number for one of Paul Helliwell's drug shipping companies in Thailand, and it being answered by the secretary of the DEA office. It was the same phone number.
That's hysterical, but totally makes sense. Totally makes sense.
Yeah, go ahead, SR71.
Thank you, Colonel, and thank everybody for attending today, and all those on Rumble and here on X. We really appreciate it. We love these sessions with you, Colonel. There was one other interesting fact that I came up against when you were talking about Cuba, and that when Castro nationalized the sugar plantations and moved everybody out, wanted to pay the U.S. and the oligarchs for everything, that is still at the heart of the beef of the matter today between the U.S. and Canada. The oligarchs are claiming now that, well, gee, we still need to get paid for all of this. Not only do we want to get paid, we want to get paid for lost profits, we want to get paid for other kinds of stuff as well. It just blows my mind.
Yeah.
Thank you, Colonel.
Sure. Oh, and by the way, before we leave Ingalls, I just want to mention when he left the Office of Public Safety, when it was disbanded, do you know where he shows up? He shows up over in Rhodesia, that turned into Zimbabwe, that the CIA was destabilizing through the use of South Africa.
Of course he did.
Of course he did. Yes, exactly. So Ingalls 100% was CIA the entire time he was doing that, and the Office of Public Safety unequivocally was a CIA front to train terrorists to attack their own people. And I would argue, based on what we are discovering, and there's a little bit more beef to this as we go through the book, these national police forces were the latest version of Gladio operators, because they're going to be unleashed through terror, kidnappings, all of the same things. They're just using in Latin America the OPS trained national police forces to do what they did with stay behind units in Europe. So that's basically the way you view the Office of Public Safety. Eduardo, did you wanted to say something?
Good afternoon, Colonel. Good afternoon, everybody. Colonel, it's not exactly what you're talking about. I just need to make you a question and also an invitation. So if you can push me to the back, to the end, it would be better. That way I won't disrupt your conversation. Whatever you want. You choose. You decide.
Well, there's nobody else up here speaking, and there's nobody else asking questions, so go ahead.
Okay. The first question is, I've been following what you've been saying about everything, Claudio, Cuba, Batista, all of that. Remember that we spoke about maybe 6-7 months ago?
Yes, I remember you.
And I don't have much time to do all the investigations and all of that. We've been busy, pretty much informing the Cuban people how to remove the Castro from power and all of that. But things are starting evolving in a different direction. Some of us have been working with investigating deeper on many of the things that you're talking about. We also find out maybe recently that the Truth report, I don't know if you know something about that report, was pretty much a made up report, a convenient report to justify the dismantling the Cuban Republic. But I also heard the other day, saw your video about the interview with Tucker Carlson and Langguth, and I couldn't agree more with you, what you were saying. So, first thing first, the question is, could you provide me some permission or whatever to use some of your material to be posted on our website, so that way everybody can access the same information? For that, I'm going to need to make some translation into the Spanish and all of that. So I need to ask your permission. I'm not the owner of the content. So that's the question.
You can take any of my content and translate it to Spanish if you want to.
Okay, because your video, probably you're going to have to download the video and use all the tools available to make a captioning and all of that into Spanish, so people will understand exactly what you're talking about. Okay?
Sure.
So for that, yeah, go ahead.
No, I'm saying you can take any of it and translate it to Spanish.
Oh, well, thank you, Coronel. I appreciate it.
Sure.
Now, the invitation part. I would like to invite you to one of our stages. They are normally conducted Monday and Tuesday from 9 a.m. to 12 p.m. About 3 hours, 2 hours and a half, 3 hours, no more than 3 hours. And I would like to invite you there for, to talk about Claudio related things with Cuba, Batista, and all of that. So you can put something together for us. Some of our people, most of the people in our group understand English. Some, a lot of them can speak English even better than me. And it would be highly appreciated too if you can spend some time with us and make like a 3-hour space with us.
Sure.
Talking about all the things, put everything together, because that way I can make the same thing. I can translate everything into Spanish and send it to the people that really need it the most, the Cuban people, and
sure.
the people that really need it the most, all
sure.
this information.
Sure. I just followed you back. If you want to DM me, we can arrange a time.
Okay. I already followed you, so the only thing that I need you to follow me back.
I just did.
I also started following Bridget, and that way it will be a lot easier for us to agree on the timing.
Yep.
Now,
I am following you too, Eduardo.
Thank you, Bridget. I think just ahead of the time, ahead of things, maybe we can start planning for the next week. Late next week. So I'm telling you right now.
Okay. I will look at my schedule and I will DM you.
So Thursday next week, 9 p.m. in the afternoon at night, we're going to be talking with Colonel Joaquin about Claudio, Cuba, Castro, Batista, Kennedy, the coup d'etat that removed the republic from Cuba, and all of that stuff. Okay? Thank you, Colonel. Highly appreciate it.
No problem.
Okay?
No problem. Sure. If you can stick around for a minute or two, I do want to. Did you read my post that I made yesterday or today? My days fall together about Karen Bass, the mayor of Los Angeles, and her supposed ties to Cuba. Eduardo,
I didn't read it yet. But I can tell you something from my past. Okay. I remember there's also a person in here. It's a Jorge C40 that can also tell me something about that. I remember on the 1991, 1992, 93, the beginning of the 90s, there was a bunch of Americans visiting Cuba. Pretty much they all were disguised as art merchants or gallery owners or things like that. That move was then later, I think I was about 1998, 1999. That scene, the move, was exposed by the counterintelligence service. But at that time, I was living here in the United States, and at that time, I learned a lot from what Castro was saying and started making the match between what I saw there at that time and what the Castro was saying. And now you're saying me that the person from LA is tied to Cuba and the Cuban regime. That is not something that you cannot find easily. That's easy to find. There's a bunch of Americans visiting Cuba, also creating ONGs, and we're asking money to USAID to benefit Cuban programs. So there's a bunch of ties in there.
So what I wanted to point out that I found is during the time when she was supposedly starting these 8 different trips to Cuba during the 1960s. So this is a little earlier.
Wow.
In the immediate aftermath of the revolution. So she made her first trip there supposedly at 19. So if I go back and I look at State Department documents about the ability to travel to Cuba was basically non-existent. There was like 3 different categories that were allowed to go there. And all of those approved visas to travel to Cuba had to be done through the State Department, which we know is in bed with the CIA. And the groups, at least the leadership of the groups, were briefed before they go over there on what intelligence the CIA and State Department wanted from them, and they were debriefed when they came back. So the allegation that Karen Bass is a communist is bullshit. She was part of a project that went over throughout the course of the 1960s and early 70s to basically gather intelligence. And the organization that she was part of, that Venceremos Brigade, was part of the Students for a Democrat Society, which basically had overlapping leadership with the CIA's National Student Association, which has been, openly discussed as a CIA front. And they also had ties to the Weather Underground and other Operation Gladio terror cells in Europe. So anyone that's telling you that Karen Bass is a communist is lying to you. One of the major projects of this group when they went to Cuba was to overproduce sugar under the Castro regime, and by doing so, flooded the market the world market with sugar, which drastically reduced the prices of sugar and almost collapsed Cuba's entire country because the reduction in the price of sugar. So they were basically sabotaging him economically. And somehow no one can actually read history and understand that this group did more to sabotage Castro than they ever did to try to support him. And just coincidentally, this same person with what I've discovered to be obvious CIA ties is sitting as the mayor of Los Angeles during what is a destabilization exercise, which we know is part and parcel of how the CIA begins the destabilization part of pitting people against each other in order to overthrow governments. And it is no coincidence that she is sitting in Los Angeles as the mayor during the fire and all of this other shit. So if you understand Operation Gladio and you go back and you look at these people's past, it's much easier to understand what they're actually being used for in the current day. She is not a communist. As a matter of fact, I put a good monthly paycheck on the fact that she is in the CIA or at least affiliated with it.
I pinned that post.
Yeah, it's crazy.
Well, it's not surprising to me, believe me. For some weird reason, the Cuban government and the United States government have been tied together doing crazy things, both at the same time, with the backing on one to each other. So that's a weird thing there with this.
Yeah, and if you look at other people that were in that same brigade, another Los Angeles mayor was there, prominent labor union official, and Clinton administration appointee Karen Nussbaum, a former Spelman College and Bennett College president, Johnetta Cole, a Georgetown University, which we know is one of the CIA's favorite, and magazine co-editor Michael Kazin. So these are people that have been prominent in the Democrat Party, supposedly all part of this communist brigade. And I'm telling you that none of those people were communist. So
that sounds rational, you know?
Yeah.
Because they use these guys. They get around a lot of people, a lot of backing from different people. When people probably we never know they're being played by CIA opera. So
yes,
that's the reason and all of that.
Yep.
Anytime you look around in the history, the history of the last 60, 70 years, you will see pretty much the same play.
Yes.
Play it again and again and again and again with little variations.
Yes, it's called patterns, and we're into pattern recognition.
The most visible pattern also, if you look at the Cuban history since the 1940s around, you will see most of the patterns of today. Seeing that look around us, you will see all these patterns, all these plays played in Cuba a long time ago. For that reason, there's many Cubans that say that Cuba has been like an experimental lab for the CIA.
Yeah.
To try and prove different things.
Yes.
With the knowledge of the captors.
Yes.
So that's the with the part. With the part of that is that.
Yeah, I can't disagree with that. Okay, guys, tonight is my family dinner night, so I'm gonna.
Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Eduardo. I'm going to go ahead and sign off and wish you guys all a good evening. I will be on the Alpha Warrior Show for part 2 of our show from last week. If you haven't watched it, run out and watch that show because we are going to pick up where we left off on the deep dive into Barack Obama and whether or not he's a Manchurian candidate. And that will be at 9:30 unless Alpha changes it again. But otherwise, podcast Alpha Warrior program at 9:30, and I will be back here tomorrow at 4:00 to pick up where we left off. Thank you, everybody, for being here. Okay, over here, let me see. Let's see. Go out to bread maker. Shout out. Oh, shout out. Oh, there you go, bread maker. Thank you for being here. Have a vacation day today. Oh my gosh. Well, congratulations for having a vacation day and being here with us. I am honored to have you here. I love the fact that you show up here occasionally, and I'm glad that you almost never miss one of our Alpha Warrior shows. It's just I always look for you in the comments. So thank you for being here. Appreciate that. And Donnie Vision, Mother Goose 3, thank you for being here. And all of the rest of you guys, Flyover IRL, Random Drive-By, recommendation by the algorithm I chose to click. What is this site all about? This site is all about Operation Gladio and how our government has lied to us for the last 80 years while backing all of the terrorist organizations, but telling us that they're organic. And we bring the proof through book reviews. And I'm glad that the algorithm, you guys see the comments do it. And you guys following, subscribing to the channel, this active comments that you guys have here every day is pushing up. Make sure you give us a thumbs up. That obviously matters as well. While you're watching the podcast, even if you're not watching it live, please give us a thumbs up. It does push us up. Finally, we're getting into the algorithm. I don't know that I've ever had anybody say that before, so that's a good sign. But anyway, thanks for being here, everybody. I appreciate it.